the most confusing battle of WWII, Operation Crusader 1941. In November 1941, in the deserts of North Africa, hundreds of tanks fought each other in a battle so chaotic that at times, neither side's generals knew where their own units actually were. Commanders were captured by accident, driving straight into enemy lines they didn't know were there. Entire armored divisions lost contact with headquarters for days. British generals were relieved of command in the middle of the battle, not because they had failed, but because nobody above them could tell if they were winning or losing. This wasn't a battle decided by brilliant strategy. It was decided by confusion, exhaustion, and which side could survive its own mistakes the longest. This is the story of Operation Crusader, arguably the most chaotic and misunderstood major battle of the Second World War, fought between two of the most fascinating commanders of the entire conflict, and a battle that even the men who fought in it struggled to explain afterward. By the autumn of 1941, the war in North Africa had settled into a strange, brutal stalemate. Erwin Rommel, commanding the German Afrika Corps alongside Italian forces, had pushed British and Commonwealth troops back across Libya earlier that year, in a campaign so fast and aggressive it earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. But Rommel's advance had stalled at the Egyptian border, and one isolated pocket of resistance remained defiantly behind his lines, the port city of Tobruk. Tobruk's garrison, made up largely of Australian troops and later reinforced by British units, had been besieged for months, cut off by land but resupplied by sea through the Royal Navy, in conditions that soldiers compared to the trench warfare of the First World War. Holding Tobruk denied Rommel a crucial port, forced him to supply his forces over impossibly long desert routes, and tied down significant German resources just to maintain the siege. By late 1941, the British Eighth Army, newly formed and commanded by General Alan Cunningham, had assembled the strength to attempt something ambitious, not simply to relieve Tobruk, but to destroy Rommel's panzer divisions in open battle and push the Axis forces entirely out of Libya. This operation was named Crusader, and it launched on November 18, 1941, with an assumption baked into its very design that would soon prove disastrously optimistic. British planners believed that if they could force a decisive tank battle in open desert, their superior numbers of tanks would simply grind down German armor through attrition. What followed was one of the most confusing, sprawling, and poorly coordinated battles of the entire war. And understanding why requires understanding just how strange desert warfare actually was. The North African desert offered almost none of the terrain features that battles in Europe typically relied on. There were no rivers to anchor a defensive line, no forests to hide movement, no dense road networks to predict where an enemy might advance. It was, in the words of soldiers who fought there, like fighting a naval battle on land. Units moved in open formation across vast, largely featureless terrain, navigating by compass bearing as much as by landmarks, and visibility was often reduced to a few hundred meters by dust, heat shimmer, or sudden sandstorms. This meant that armored formations, moving fast and independently, could lose track of each other, lose track of the enemy, and even lose track of their own supply lines within hours. Radio communication, still relatively primitive and unreliable across the distances involved, frequently broke down entirely. Commanders sometimes had a better understanding of the battle from intercepted enemy radio transmissions than from their own units reporting in. When Operation Crusader began, the British Eighth Army pushed forward with roughly 700 tanks, facing a combined German and Italian force with far fewer, perhaps around 320 tanks total, though German tanks and anti-tank guns were, in several respects, technically superior to their British counterparts. On paper, the British had every advantage. In practice, the battle almost immediately spiraled into chaos. The first major clash came around an area known as Sidi Rezegh, where British armored units, advancing with confidence, ran directly into a devastating counterattack from Rommel's panzer divisions. British tank crews, many operating with outdated tactical doctrine that emphasized aggressive, unsupported cavalry-style charges, suffered catastrophic losses when they encountered German anti-tank guns used in coordinated defensive positions, a tactic the German army had refined far more effectively than the British at this stage of the war. Within days, British tank strength had been reduced dramatically, and General Cunningham, watching his numbers collapse faster than intelligence reports could explain, began to lose confidence in the entire operation. He proposed to his superiors that the offensive be called off, that the losses were unsustainable, and that 8th Army should withdraw to preserve what remained of its armored force. This is where Operation Crusader takes one of its strangest turns. General Claude Auchinleck, the overall theater commander, refused to accept Cunningham's assessment. Auchinleck believed, correctly as it turned out, that German losses, though harder to observe, were also severe, and that Rommel's forces were being pushed to a breaking point that Cunningham's more pessimistic reading of the battlefield had missed entirely. Auchinleck made an extraordinary decision. He relieved Cunningham of command in the middle of an active major battle and personally installed a new commander, General Neil Ritchie, to continue the offensive. This kind of command change mid-battle was almost unheard of in the war, and it reflects just how confusing and difficult to read the battlefield situation genuinely was. Two experienced, competent generals, looking at roughly the same information, had reached opposite conclusions about whether the battle was being won or lost. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Rommel was making decisions that would become one of the most debated moments of his entire career. Believing that British forces were on the verge of collapse, and characteristically eager to seize the initiative through bold, aggressive action, Rommel launched a deep armored thrust toward the Egyptian border, hoping to cut off British supply lines and trigger a full retreat. This maneuver, which became known as Rommel's dash to the wire, is still debated by military historians today. Some consider it a brilliant, characteristically audacious gamble that nearly paid off. Others consider it a serious overreach, a moment where Rommel's aggressive instincts outran his actual battlefield intelligence, leaving his own forces dangerously exposed and disconnected from their supply lines at a critical moment. What is not debated is the confusion it caused. As Rommel's panzers drove deep into British-held territory, they passed directly through and around British rear area units, support columns, and even headquarters positions, without either side fully realizing how close they were to each other. British support troops, cooks, mechanics, and supply personnel suddenly found German tanks driving past their positions, sometimes within a few hundred meters, in a desert landscape where there simply weren't clear front lines to define where the battle actually was. In one of the more remarkable moments of the entire campaign, senior officers on both sides came dangerously close to being captured entirely by accident, simply by driving in the wrong direction and running into enemy forces they had no idea were there. This wasn't unusual in the North African campaign. The lack of a clear front line meant that command vehicles, supply trucks, and even entire headquarters units could suddenly find themselves behind what should have been enemy lines, or driving directly toward a battle that intelligence reports had placed somewhere else entirely. While Rommel's dash to the wire caused chaos and genuine alarm among British commanders, it ultimately achieved less than he had hoped. British forces, rather than collapsing, held their positions with the newly appointed General Ritchie coordinating a defense, while other British units continued pressing the primary objective of the campaign, the relief of Tobruk. Rommel, realizing his forces were now dangerously exposed, low on fuel, and disconnected from adequate supply, was forced to turn his panzers back to support his main defensive positions, abandoning the momentum his dash had briefly created. By the end of November and into early December 1941, the accumulated pressure of weeks of grinding, confusing combat had done exactly what Auchinleck had gambled it would. German and Italian forces, unable to sustain their losses in tanks, fuel, and men at the same rate the British could replace theirs, began a general withdrawal. On December 10, 1941, after nearly 8 months under siege, Tobruk was finally relieved. British and Commonwealth forces linked up with the garrison that had held out against extraordinary pressure for the better part of a year. Rommel continued to withdraw his forces westward across Libya, eventually pulling back hundreds of kilometers to more defensible positions, effectively surrendering almost all the territory his earlier offensive had captured. By any conventional measure, Operation Crusader was a British and Commonwealth victory. Tobruk was relieved. Rommel was pushed back. The immediate strategic objective of the offensive had been achieved, and yet, almost nobody involved in the battle on either side would have described it as a clean or well-executed victory. British tank losses throughout the campaign were severe, arguably disproportionate to the eventual result, and reflected serious ongoing problems with British armored doctrine, tank design, and coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor that would continue to plague the desert campaign for months afterward. The mid-battle relief of an army commander remains one of the more extraordinary command decisions of the entire war, a decision that could easily have gone the other way, and one that historians still debate as either a display of Auchinleck's superior strategic judgment or simply a fortunate gamble that happened to pay off. Rommel's own conduct during the battle is similarly difficult to cleanly evaluate. His dash to the wire has been alternately praised as bold, aggressive leadership in the finest tradition of maneuver warfare, and criticized as a reckless overextension that very nearly cost him his entire armored force at a moment when a more cautious commander might have consolidated a stronger defensive position instead. What makes Operation Crusader genuinely distinctive among major battles of the Second World War isn't a single dramatic turning point or a clear moment where the outcome became obvious. It is the sheer, sustained confusion that defined nearly every stage of the fighting. Neither side had reliable, continuous understanding of where the other's forces actually were. Both sides made major command decisions, including the extraordinary step of relieving an army commander mid-battle, based on incomplete and often contradictory information. And the final outcome was determined less by a decisive tactical masterstroke from either commander, and more by which side could continue absorbing punishing losses the longest, before the other side's supply lines and morale gave out first. For soldiers who fought in Operation Crusader, many later described the experience less as a coherent battle with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and more as weeks of disconnected, chaotic engagements, ambushes, and confused encounters scattered across hundreds of kilometers of featureless desert, with almost no reliable sense, from the perspective of an individual tank crew or infantry unit, of how the broader battle was actually unfolding. This is, in many ways, exactly why Operation Crusader remains such a fascinating and underappreciated episode of the Second World War. It offers none of the clean narrative simplicity of battles that are more commonly remembered, no single decisive moment that historians can point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, it offers something arguably more honest about the reality of desert warfare in this period of the conflict. A battle won not through clarity, brilliance, or decisive maneuver, but through sheer attritional endurance, fought by commanders who, for much of the battle, genuinely did not know whether they were winning or losing. Operation Crusader would not be the last major battle fought across this same stretch of North African desert. Rommel would return to the offensive again within months, and the back-and-forth struggle for control of Libya and Egypt would continue for nearly another 2 years, culminating eventually in the decisive Battle of El Alamein. But Crusader remains a crucial, often overlooked chapter in that longer story, a battle that demonstrated both the extraordinary tactical skill of Rommel's forces and the resilience of British and Commonwealth troops who, despite serious doctrinal and organizational problems, absorbed devastating losses and still emerged, eventually, in control of the battlefield. If you're finding this story as strange and fascinating as I did researching it, this is exactly the kind of overlooked, misunderstood battle this channel exists to explore. Subscribe, because the most interesting stories from this war are rarely the ones everyone already knows. Perhaps the most fitting way to understand Operation Crusader is not as a battle that was won or lost through skill alone, but as a battle that revealed, with unusual clarity, just how much of war is actually decided by confusion, incomplete information, and which side manages to endure that confusion longest without breaking. Rommel would go on to become one of the most studied commanders of the entire war. Auchinleck's gamble to relieve Cunningham mid-battle would become a case study in command psychology under pressure, and Operation Crusader itself would remain, for those who study it closely, a reminder that some of history's most consequential battles are also its most genuinely confusing, understood clearly only in hindsight, and barely understood at all by the men who were actually fighting them at the time. If you want to know what happened next, when Rommel returned to the offensive just months later and nearly reversed everything Crusader had achieved, let me know in the comments, because that story is even stranger than this one.